Hello, my name is Craig Murray, and this is my first ever podcast. This is me at home in my study, and this is going to be pretty basic. We are fitting out this study eventually, once we get enough money, in order to be a studio, have different cameras, have very good sound, and be able to show you different shots, and also have guests in and interview. But for the moment we're not there yet, so this is going to be just me talking to the camera in this position, and I do apologise if that's not very thrilling for you, but I hope the words are at least interesting. And I wanted to start today because it's the 700th anniversary of the Declaration of Arbroath, which is something that means a lot in Scottish history and means a lot to me personally. I also wanted to start because tomorrow would have been the start of a speaking tour I was hoping to do around Scotland. I had over 30 different Yes groups and SNP branches who had invited me, and we were getting a schedule together, and I hope once we got going it would have expanded out to many more than just 30 groups. But unfortunately, because of coronavirus, we've had to put that on hold. But I wanted today to say some of the things I would have said in giving those talks. So let's start with the Declaration of Arbroath. It is, of course, the great statement of Scottish independence, but it's much more than that. I want to start with the bit that everybody knows, the bit that you'll find on a million tea towels. For as long as 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be subjected to the lordship of the English. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom alone, which no honest man gives up, but with life itself. It's a wonderful sentiment, it's a wonderful statement of identity, it's a wonderful statement of idealism and of willingness to sacrifice. It sounds beautiful in English, it sounds beautiful in the original Latin. And for me, it encapsulates the feeling in many ways of the 2014 referendum campaign. The idea expressed in community gatherings, expressed in spontaneous street gatherings, expressed all around the country, that we would seize back national freedom, that we would take back control of our own affairs, and we would form our own society according to our own cultural and social priorities, that Scotland would become a much more communitarian place, a much more caring place at home, and also in foreign affairs would become a much less frankly violent country, wouldn't invade other people, would play a responsible role in international institutions, and what of course Robin Cook always called an ethical foreign policy. That aspect of it was important to me as well. It was something which people would widely talk about during the campaign. And for me, all of that about freedom and about the kind of people we are, and being the kind of people we want to be, open, pro-immigration, caring is a good word, a society built on empathy, that was worth fighting for. And that ability to be our own community is something our ancestors were prepared to die for. That always seemed to me much more important, bluntly, than questions about exactly what currency we would use. There are hundreds of countries in this world. The vast majority of them have their own country, and the vast majority of those currencies function perfectly effectively. I never understood, to this day I don't understand, why people thought that Scots people are somehow less competent than Irish people or Danish people or Swedish people, are unable to run our own affairs, are unable to decide which currency we have and manage a currency. I used to work a lot in Ghana. I had a company in Ghana that built power stations. We used to buy things like Toyota Land Cruisers in the local currency, which functioned. The idea that Ghana can have a functioning currency and Scotland could not always seemed to me quite extraordinary. But it also seemed to me extraordinary that people coming from a nation where people were prepared to lay down their own lives for freedom, and people did lay down their own lives for our freedom over hundreds of years, would suddenly wonder whether a tiny personal drop in their own living standards was more important than freedom. And I'm a hopeless political campaigner in many ways. I don't try to be all things to all people. I always believed that people who would rather have £2 more in their pocket than Scottish independence are people who should be despised. I don't think we should pander to materialism. I know there are people who live in hardship. Believe you me, I know. I know that there are people who struggle to get by. In an independent Scotland, we'd make sure people don't struggle. I happen to believe that the economy of an independent Scotland would be much stronger than the economy of a subservient Scotland, as Ireland proved once it stopped suffering from the effects of UK economic punishment, which lasted a long while. But nowadays, Ireland is much wealthier per capita than the UK is. No country that ever became independent of the UK, and there are scores of countries that became independent of the UK, not one of them ever asked to come back. So, yeah, I don't have a lot of time for the unionism of cowardice. Let me put it that way, and I could never be bothered to pretend that I do. To move on, for me, the most important part of the Declaration of Arbroath is the words that came immediately before the passage I just read out, where they talk of having chosen Robert the Bruce as their king, and then they say, "Yet, if he should give up what he has begun, seeking to make us or our kingdom subject to the King of England or the English, we should exert ourselves at once to drive him out as our enemy and a subverter of his own right and ours, and make sure some other man who is well able to defend us, our king." And that is a very modern thought. There are people out there, unionists, who want to denigrate the Declaration of Arbroath, who, with immense stupidity, criticise it because it doesn't read like a document which was written now. It reads like a document which was written 700 years ago. And because, of course, it is a document which was written 700 years ago, so it is phrased as an appeal to the papacy. 700 years ago, they didn't have the International Court of Justice. They didn't have the United Nations. The supranational Court of Appeal, if you like, was the papacy. That's just how society was. There's no point in criticising it now. That's why they appealed to the papacy. And yes, of course, it was written by a lot of lords because they didn't have a democracy 700 years ago. That's true. When these people spoke of the rights of people and laying down their life for their country, they weren't thinking too far about the rights of the peasants who may work for them. In some cases, and we should say that clan society was in general a much more democratic concept than strictly feudal society. It's actually not quite right to believe that these people were running straight feudalism. They weren't. But in general, yes, these were aristocrats, because in general it is an obvious truth, a truth really not worth stating, that the world was not democratic, and that time. But then how democratic is it now? You know, how many people in Scotland voted for the United Kingdom government which is ruling over them? We now have a situation where it seems reasonably certain that a majority of Scots favour independence, or at least something very close to a majority, and the government in Westminster is refusing them to allow them a vote. So how democratic is society now? How very different really was society then? When we have elections which are swayed by the media, the corporate media, who are owned by literally a handful of billionaires, who by and large subsidise media which loses money, and they subsidise it because it's worth their while to sway public opinion in order for their other business interests to benefit from having right-wing governments that do what they say. So how democratic is that system? How democratic is a state media where the government effectively appoints all the people who head it, and they all appoint people who go along with what the government thinks broadly about life? Sometimes I think that the situation where we are given a very limited choice every few years, and where by and large most people in society have very limited means of knowledge and are subjected to constant propaganda paid for largely by a governing class and a few billionaires, the extent to which we really actually have a worthwhile and functioning democracy today, I think can be exaggerated. I think we brainwash ourselves about how great Western democracy is. I'm really not sure that in real life the mechanics of power have moved on as far in this last 700 years as we like to believe they have. But the sentiment itself is radical. The sentiment itself is revolutionary. They are claiming here the right to appoint their own king. And they're stating that if the king doesn't do what they want, they'll kick him out and get another king. You can't overstate what a radical thought that was in 1320. I'm quite sure it's not a thought that was particularly welcome to the Pope. And it's not a thought you get again in European thought for a long, long while. This is way in advance of its time. And that's where it's important to say that the things we say about Scotland, where we say that there is an actual meaning to the king having been the King of Scots rather than the King of Scotland, where there's a meaning to the claim of right and the claim that sovereignty lies with the people, that is a demonstrable strain of Scottish thought that is different not only to England but different to really the rest of Europe, and goes back a long, long way. When you study philosophy at university, certainly when I was a young man, you study Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and their ideas of the social contract, you're taught that what Hobbes and Locke were saying, and after them Jean-Jacques Rousseau, about the social contract and the fact that people choose their ruler, and if the ruler doesn't do what they want, then the people have got a right to change their ruler. You're told that was revolutionary thought. That was revolutionary thought. And that came 300 to 400 years after the Declaration of Arbroath said the same thing very, very plainly and very succinctly. This is way ahead in European political thought of anything else that was said at the time or said for centuries. So for me, that's one of the reasons this is an extremely important document. Anyway, that's the Declaration of Arbroath. I want to get on now to that question of Scottish independence and where we go from here, because we seem to be at a dead end. We seem to have some horrible disagreements within the independence movement itself about how quickly we move, about what we do, and about how we can move forward if post-coronavirus Boris Johnson continues to refuse to agree to a Section 30 agreement and to the holding of another independence referendum in Scotland. I want to be clear about one thing. Independence is not a matter of domestic law. Independence is a matter of international law. The independence of a state is an existence which is recognised by other states. That's what makes you an independent state. You are treated as an equal and recognised as part of the family of nations by other states. It doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. It doesn't matter what your domestic law is. It doesn't matter what the state you are seceding from thinks. You are an independent state if other states say you are. And equally, you can have as much domestic legislation as you want that says that you are an independent state, and you can have a state you're seceding from which also says you are. But that has no effect at all if other independent states don't recognise you as a state. Recognition by the General Assembly of the United Nations is the way you become a sovereign state, and the only way you can become a sovereign state. And that's something which is seldom understood. So it is only recognition by the General Assembly of the United Nations that makes you an independent state. And being an independent state is a function of international law, not a function of domestic law. And it's also worth saying that the majority of states in the world have become independent in my own lifetime, and very few of them have done so with a referendum. Not only is a referendum not a requirement in international law for a state to become independent, it's actually quite rare, it's quite unusual. And that includes several European Union states which have become independent without a referendum. You don't have to have one. And I will say, one thing that actually makes me very angry, well, one thing that makes my hackles rise, is when people say that the 2014 referendum was any kind of gold standard. It was anything but a gold standard. It was a referendum in which the extreme bias of the state media played a major role in determining the outcome. There's so many occasions. Do you remember Nick Robinson asking the question of Alex Salmond at the Edinburgh International Conference Centre, then putting out on the 6 o'clock news that Alex had failed to answer, whereas in fact Alex had given him a full economic lecture as an answer? Do you remember the propaganda organisation Vote No Borders, which didn't actually exist at all, being run for a whole day with an 8-minute propaganda piece fronted by Gavin Esler on every single BBC news and all day on their dedicated news channel, putting out propaganda about a grassroots organisation that hated the idea of separation, and the organisation quite literally did not exist. The whole thing was a totally fake PR stunt, as I'm quite certain Gavin Esler and the BBC very well knew. There's no way when you've got the state broadcaster behaving like that that you can claim there was a gold standard referendum. It's absolute nonsense. Do you remember Rory Stewart's programme broadcast during a referendum campaign where he claimed that there was no such thing as England and Scotland, and he had some idea of this middle land and building a cairn as a sign that England and Scotland were all the same thing and we shared a common culture and weren't separate. Broadcast for an hour or so, paid for by the BBC, straight propaganda piece, middle of the referendum, didn't count as referendum broadcasting as far as the BBC were concerned from a point of view of bias. It was obvious nonsense. That's even before we come to the breaking of the Purdah rules, the vow promising Devo Max and how everything would change, how Scotland would be as close to federalism as it's possible to be. In the last week, absolute game changer, invented by the Daily Record, over every single form of media that there is, and just a load of complete lies. Telling lies, of course, during the referendum campaign is not illegal. Breaking purdah is and was illegal. Nothing done about it. Swayed the campaign. It was built in as a panic measure, as was the Queen, of course, with the nudge, nudge, witch wink, Queen is very concerned messages coming out. There was so much cheating in the 2014 referendum, and that's even before we get on to 98% turnouts on the postal ballot, which is impossible due to the number of people who normally would have died or moved or whatever, and the fact that, remarkably, in the places where there was the most street enthusiasm, where most people were out and about, where there was quite exceptional levels of support for independence in Glasgow and Dundee, somehow their turnout were kind of 10% below the rest of the country, which seems, again, slightly improbable. Nobody can call the 2014 referendum a gold standard in my hearing, or they're going to get a mouthful. So, what do we do now? How do we proceed when Boris Johnson vetoes a Section 30? Well, as I've stated, national independence is not a state of domestic law, it's a state of international law. If you actually believe Scotland should be independent, then you must believe that Scotland is a nation. I don't understand how anybody can believe Scotland is independent and not believe Scotland should be independent and not believe Scotland is a nation. If you believe Scotland is a nation, you believe that Scotland has the right of self-determination under the United Nations Charter, and you believe that Scotland has the right to act without Westminster permission. If you don't believe Scotland has the right to act without Westminster permission, then you don't actually believe in Scottish independence at all. You don't believe Scotland is a nation, and I think it would be better if you stopped pretending to be part of the independence movement and went and lined up openly with the Unionists. We are a nation. We have the right to self-determination. We are entitled to our independence without the authority of any other nation, and that means without the authority of Westminster. So how do we take that forward in practice? Well, there are of course several possibilities. We could hold what Nicola Sturgeon disparagingly called a wildcat or illegal referendum. No reason at all to believe it would be illegal. It hasn't yet been tested in court, but does it matter if it's illegal? Because, as I've explained to you, it's not UK domestic legislation that governs independence, it's international law. And it is absolutely normal for a nation to become independent in a way that is illegal in domestic law. It was not legal in domestic Soviet law for Estonia, Latvia or Lithuania to become independent. That wasn't a Soviet legal process, that broke Soviet law. It is the norm for a country to become independent by breaking the domestic law of the entity for which it's seceding. That goes without saying. It's obviously, generally speaking, going to be true. And it's not only me that is saying that. I'm going to read you something here. It's something which the United Kingdom government has said again and again and again. It is the opinion of the government of the United Kingdom that a state can break the domestic law of the state it is leaving in order to become independent. Now, I want to read you now a little passage from the United Kingdom arguing exactly that before the International Court of Justice. And this was in the Kosovo case, where the UK was arguing that Kosovo had a right to independence whether Yugoslavia or Serbia agreed or not. This is the UK arguing. Consistent with this general approach, international law has not treated the legality of the act of secession under the internal law of the predecessor state as determining the effect of that act on the international plane. You understand? The internal law of a state doesn't make the act of secession legal or illegal internationally. In most cases of secession, of course, the predecessor state's law will not have been complied with. That is true almost as a matter of definition. So that's the UK government saying exactly what I said. That as a matter of definition, it's going to be illegal for you to become independent in domestic law, but it doesn't matter. And this is where they say exactly that. UK government again. Nor is compliance with the law of the predecessor state a condition for the declaration of independence to be recognised by third states, if other conditions for recognition are fulfilled. So if you meet the other conditions for recognition, those conditions are broadly that you are a people with the right of self-determination under the UN Charter and that you have control of your own territory. If you meet those other conditions, the fact you've broken the law of the domestic state you're leaving has no effect. The conditions do not include compliance with the internal legal requirements of the predecessor state. There you are. So the conditions to be recognised are control of your own territory and being a people with the right of self-determination. The conditions to be recognised do not include not breaking the law of the state you're leaving. UK government again. Otherwise, the international legality of a secession would be predetermined by the very system of internal law called in question by the circumstances in which the secession is occurring. But again, UK government saying otherwise it would be impossible. Otherwise, your attempt at secession would simply be predetermined by the fact that the country you're trying to leave made it illegal. And the right of the people cannot be stopped like that. They carry on. The next paragraph. For the same reason, the constitutional authority of the seceding entity, so that's the country leaving, Scotland, to proclaim independence within the predecessor state is not determinative as a matter of international law. Now this is absolutely the key question. It doesn't matter if the Scottish Parliament has, within the UK, the constitutional authority to proclaim independence. That's irrelevant. If Scotland is a nation with the right of self-determination, and if the Scottish Parliament can control the country, then the Scottish Parliament has the constitutional authority in international law to declare independence whether the UK agrees or not. And here again, this is the UK government arguing, and listen to these words very carefully because these words say exactly what I've just said. In most, if not all cases, provincial or regional authorities, the Scottish Parliament, will lack the constitutional authority to secede. Exactly. In terms of the UK constitution, it's true. The Scottish government doesn't have, the Scottish Parliament doesn't have the authority to secede. But, next sentence, the act of secession is not thereby excluded. Moreover, representative institutions, the Scottish Parliament, may legitimately act and seek to reflect the views of their constituents beyond the scope of already conferred power. Listen to that. And this is the UK government arguing before the International Court of Justice. The representative institution, the Scottish Parliament, has the right to act in representing its constituents, because its constituents voted for it and want it, beyond the scope of its powers. beyond the scope of already conferred power. So the fact that the government of the United Kingdom hasn't conferred the power to declare independence on the Scottish Parliament does not stop the Scottish Parliament doing it. And even, or less in fact, but this is an important step, note, that makes perfectly plain that whether or not the United Kingdom government has conferred the power to hold a referendum on the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Parliament nevertheless has that right, because it is the Parliament representative of a nation with the right of self-determination, and therefore, in reflecting the view of its constituents, it has that power to hold a referendum. The UK government was actually asked a question by one of the judges in the International Court of Justice, asking them to clarify their position. And this is what they said. And what the judge was basically saying was, well, look, there's nothing in law that says you can do it. How can you? To which the UK came back and said, in effect, it's not how international law works. In international law, as in law in both England and Scotland, you can effectively do anything that's not prohibited. And this is what the UK government replied. As the United Kingdom stated in oral argument, international law contains no prohibitions against declarations of independence as such. Whether a declaration of independence leads to the creation of a new state by separation or secession depends not on the fact of the declaration, but on subsequent developments, notably recognition by other states. What I said to you a while back. It's recognition by other states that makes you a state. Nothing else. Nothing to do with what's happening domestically. As a general matter, this is the UK arguing again, an act not prohibited by international law needs no authorisation. You don't need any authority. There's nothing that stops Scotland declaring independence because we are a nation, and nobody's argued we're not a nation. This position holds with respect to states. It holds also with respect to acts of individuals or groups, for international law prohibits conduct of non-state entities only exceptionally and where expressly indicated. So nothing illegal, not doing anything wrong, even before we become a nation. The fact that the Scottish Parliament isn't part of an independent nation up until the time it declares Parliament doesn't make anything it does up to that point against international law, because it's not prohibited. That's what the UK government is arguing. I hope that's useful in clarifying some thoughts. That is the international position. One thing which frankly infuriates me is that I know there are people out there who disagree, and we're all entitled to our own opinions. I believe, based on my own knowledge and observation, that the Scottish National Party at the moment is run by people who aren't really that interested in independence, who don't want to push forward with it, who see pushing forward with it as endangering their own position. I think there are a lot of people there who are very happy in the careers and jobs they've got, who don't want any risk of the SNP losing power and of them losing their career and their job, and are therefore happy with the status quo under devolution. They have no intention of moving forwards towards devolution. And what I find infuriating is that they tend to hide behind the pretense that we are stymied, that in international law there's nothing we can do. Boris Johnson says no, we can't do anything. Actually, Boris Johnson saying no is utterly irrelevant in international law. What Westminster thinks is irrelevant in international law, and what the UK Parliament thinks is irrelevant in international law. And I've read you all those opinions of the UK government itself in international law, which back up exactly everything I've said to you. But also, the key point is the International Court of Justice agreed with them and accepted those arguments. What I've stated to you is the position in international law. So in practice, what do? Well, we have a number of options. The coronavirus has knocked things back a bit. And again, my own view, which you don't have to agree with, is that there are those in power who are rather keen it's knocked things back a bit because they didn't want to do anything about independence anyway. I should be very, very upset if they try to use it as an excuse for delaying next year's Scottish parliamentary elections. In the current circumstances, and given what seems likely to be a hold on things stretching into the autumn, my own view would be that we use the next Scottish parliamentary elections as in effect a referendum. And we declare not that if there's a majority for independence, they will call the referendum and then yet again come up against the famous Boris Johnson veto. And then we'll be absolutely no further forward than we are today, no further forward again at all. We don't do that. What we say is if there is a majority for independence at the next Holyrood elections, then the Scottish Parliament is going to declare independence. That's perfectly legal in international law, in the way I've just explained to you at great length. And it makes the referendum on independence the Scottish parliamentary elections. If people are against independence, fine, they've got every perfect democratic opportunity to go out and vote for a Unionist party and vote against it. I can see no democratic argument against that at all. Perfectly in line with the practice of nations. Let's make the next Scottish parliamentary elections a referendum on independence. And if we win a majority for independence, and one way or another, I'll make sure I'm a candidate in that election, among others, if we win a majority for independence, then we declare independence. Just as it was the Scottish Parliament that signed away our independence in the Treaty of Union, then let's have the Scottish Parliament bring back our independence. There are other ways. We could just hold a referendum whether or not Boris Johnson agrees. That, of course, leaves open the possibility of a unionist boycott, as in Catalonia, which is a tricky thing to deal with. We can't pretend that's not a problem. Much better to make the parliamentary elections the referendum, because the one thing you can be sure of is the unionists are not going to boycott the parliamentary elections. There are far too many of them who want to keep their well-paid jobs. So there are ways forward, and there are legal ways forward. I'm not claiming the way I've outlined is the only possible way. It's one of a number of ways. But what is not true is that we have to accept Boris Johnson's veto. And we're not going to accept Boris Johnson's veto. And to accept Boris Johnson's veto would be utter betrayal of the declaration of Arbroath. Thank you.